Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments and subscribe to our latest stories. Before I start, tell me where you're watching me from. I wonder which cities and towns will join me in this memory that has followed me for years. It started on a cold, quiet Tuesday evening. The kind where the world feels muted, and the streets glisten from a light drizzle that never quite decides to become rain. I had just finished a long day at work, the kind that drains you from the inside out, and all I wanted was to get home, make a cup of tea, and forget the world for a little while. But life has a strange way of interrupting our plans, doesn't it? When I ordered the taxi, I didn't expect anything different from the usual, some small talk, maybe a song on the radio, and a silent ride home. But the man who pulled up that night wasn't just another driver. He had kind eyes, the kind that seemed to carry both laughter and loss, and when he smiled, it felt like he'd seen enough of the world to understand people before they even spoke. "Cold night, huh?" he said as I got in, his voice warm, steady. "Feels colder than it should," I replied, brushing the drizzle from my coat. We drove in silence for a few minutes, the rhythmic hum of the tires filling the air. I remember looking out the window, watching the reflections of streetlights ripple on wet pavement, and feeling that odd sense of being alone even when someone's sitting right next to you. Then, softly, he said, "You look like someone who's had a long day." I laughed under my breath. "That obvious?" "Only to someone who knows the look," he said. "I used to see it in the mirror every night." That made me turn to him. "Used to?" "Yeah," he said, eyes fixed on the road. "Before I started driving people instead of chasing deadlines." There was something in the way he said it, half a confession, half a relief, that made me curious. His voice wasn't one of those that tried too hard to impress. It was calm, measured, and a little tired. Like he'd learned to live with whatever life had thrown his way. We talked the rest of the way, about work, about how cities can make you feel invisible, about how sometimes the best conversations are with strangers who don't expect anything from you. When we reached my street, I was almost disappointed. I wasn't ready for the quiet of my apartment yet, not after that strangely comforting ride. As I handed him the fare, he said something unexpected. "You know, I drive this route almost every night, but there's this little coffee shop by the bridge I always stop by after 9. It's quiet, old-fashioned, plays soft jazz. You'd probably like it." He paused, then added, "You're welcome to join if you ever need to sit somewhere that doesn't demand anything from you." I didn't know what to say. It wasn't a flirtatious offer, it was kind, simple, and oddly sincere. The kind of invitation that feels more like a gesture of human connection than anything else. That night, I couldn't sleep. His words replayed in my mind, the calmness in his tone, the sense of understanding that lingered between us. It wasn't attraction, it was recognition. Two people crossing paths at the right time, when maybe both needed to be reminded that not everyone you meet in passing is meant to stay a stranger. The next evening, around the same time, I found myself glancing at the clock more than once. I had no intention of going out. At least, that's what I told myself. But by 8:45, I had my coat on, and before I even realized it, I was walking toward that bridge. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of rain and roasted coffee beans. And there it was, the small coffee shop he mentioned. Yellow light spilled out from its windows, and the sound of a saxophone drifted softly through the door. I hesitated for a moment. I wasn't sure what I expected, to see him there, or maybe just to feel that quiet sense of peace again. But when I stepped inside, there he was, sitting by the window with a steaming cup in front of him, looking out at the river like someone lost in thought. He looked up, surprised but smiling. "I didn't think you'd actually come." "I didn't either," I said, taking the seat across from him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was familiar. The kind that doesn't need to be filled. He slid a menu toward me and said, "Their cinnamon coffee's the best thing you'll ever taste on a cold night." I ordered it, and he was right, it tasted like warmth and nostalgia. We talked for hours. About music, about places we missed, about the quiet ache of growing older and realizing how many things we let slip by while we were busy surviving. He told me his name was Daniel. He'd been a schoolteacher once, before life took a turn and he started driving to make ends meet. "But I like it," he said, stirring his coffee slowly. "Every night, I meet people who remind me that the world's still full of stories." By the time I looked at the clock, it was nearly midnight. The rain had started again, Tapping softly on the window. I should get going, I said, though part of me didn't want to. He nodded. Then let me drive you home. No charge this time. I smiled, hesitated for a moment, then nodded. The ride back felt different. The city outside seemed softer somehow, the streets less lonely. When we reached my door, he said, "Thank you for coming tonight." "No," I replied quietly. "Thank you for inviting me." I watched as his car disappeared down the wet street, tail lights glowing like fading embers. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something shift inside me, a reminder that kindness still exists, that sometimes the smallest encounters can leave the deepest marks. I didn't know it then, but that night was only the beginning. The next few days, I kept thinking about Daniel. It wasn't in a romantic way, more like how you think of a song that got stuck in your head because it made you feel something you didn't expect. There was a quietness about him that stayed with me, and I found myself wondering what kind of life a man like him had lived before he ended up driving strangers through the night. Work felt the same: endless meetings, the hum of computers, polite smiles that never reached the eyes. But now, there was something else underneath the routine. A small flicker of curiosity, like I'd opened a window I hadn't known was shut. On Friday evening, as I stepped outside, the air carried that faint, comforting smell of rain again. The kind that makes the city glow, as if every streetlight is whispering secrets. And before I even had time to think twice, I found myself opening the taxi app. My thumb hovered over the screen longer than it should have before I pressed order. When the car pulled up, I almost laughed to myself. What were the odds? It was him. Daniel. He rolled down the window, and that same warm voice said, "Well, that's a surprise." "Is it?" I replied, trying not to smile too widely. He chuckled. "No, I don't think it is." We started driving, but this time the silence between us wasn't shy or uncertain. It was peaceful. Like two people who didn't need to rush the conversation because they already understood the rhythm of it. "Long week?" he asked. "Too long? And too quiet?" "Then it sounds like you need another coffee," he said, glancing at me through the mirror. I didn't answer, but he turned toward the bridge anyway. The cafe was just as I remembered, the same low light, the same old jazz humming in the background, and the same smell of cinnamon drifting through the air. He ordered without asking me, and when the cups arrived, the warmth of it against my hands felt like an anchor. That night, our conversation went deeper. Not heavy, but honest. He told me about his wife, how they'd married young, how they'd grown apart without realizing it, how grief sometimes takes the shape of silence. "She passed away 8 years ago," he said quietly. "Cancer. Quick and cruel." I didn't know what to say. My throat tightened, but before I could speak, he smiled softly. "Don't look sad. I had 25 good years. That's more than most people get." Then he looked at me and added, "And now I have peace. Driving helps me listen again, to people, to stories, to life." I felt tears rise behind my eyes, not from pity, but from recognition. Loss wears a different face on everyone, but the ache behind it is universal. I told him about my own story. About how I'd built a life around work, around being reliable, steady, strong, until one day I woke up and realized I'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen. He didn't interrupt. He just listened, the way people rarely do. When I finished, he said quietly, "You know, you remind me of myself. Always giving, never pausing long enough to see what's left inside." Something about that sentence settled in my chest and stayed there. We left the cafe just before closing. The streets were nearly empty, the rain now only a mist that made the world shimmer. As he drove me home, the city felt like it was holding its breath, quiet, reflective, suspended. When he stopped in front of my building, he turned slightly toward me. "You ever think about how strangers sometimes cross paths for a reason?" I nodded. "Maybe not a reason. Maybe just timing." He smiled at that. "Yeah, timing." I didn't want to say goodbye, but I also didn't want to break the moment by forcing it. So I simply said, "Good night, Daniel." "Good night," he replied. "And, if you ever just need to drive with no destination, call me." I went inside, but I didn't turn on the lights. I stood by the window instead, watching the red tail lights fade down the street again, just like the first night, except this time, I didn't feel alone. I sat on my couch, still in my coat, staring at the reflection of the city lights on the glass. And for the first time in years, I felt something I couldn't quite name, not happiness, not sadness, but something in between. Something alive. In that quiet, I realized how many years I'd spent moving through life on autopilot, mistaking busyness for meaning. And how, in just 2 quiet nights, a stranger had managed to remind me that sometimes the smallest connections can wake us up in the gentlest way. I didn't know if I'd see him again. But I hoped I would, not because I needed him, but because, somehow, his presence made me remember myself. A week passed before I saw Daniel again. I hadn't planned to, not really. Life went back to its usual rhythm: work, groceries, calls I didn't want to make, conversations that felt like echoes. But underneath it all, his words kept coming back to me. If you ever just need to drive with no destination, call me. One night, after a long and restless day, I found myself standing at my window again. The city lights blurred softly against the glass, and a strange loneliness settled in, the kind that doesn't come from being alone, but from realizing how long you've been pretending not to be. I picked up my phone before I could talk myself out of it. When he answered, his voice sounded exactly like I remembered: calm, gentle, grounding. "Did you finally decide to take that drive?" he asked, as if he'd been expecting the call all along. "Maybe I did," I said, smiling in spite of myself. He arrived 20 minutes later. The night was cool and clear, the kind of air that wakes you up just by breathing it in. I got into the car, and we started driving without saying where to go. The radio played softly, something instrumental and soothing. After a while, Daniel said, "Do you ever realize how different the world looks when you're not rushing somewhere?" I nodded, watching the passing lights flicker across his face. "I think I forgot how to stop rushing." He smiled. "Then tonight, we practice." We drove out of the city, past the noise, past the restless glow of traffic. The road opened up, dark and wide, lined with tall trees that whispered as we passed. I rolled down the window and felt the wind pull at my hair, carrying that faint, wild scent of rain-soaked earth. For the first time in a long time, I felt freed. We ended up by the lake, quiet, still, reflecting the moon like a silver mirror. Daniel parked the car and turned off the engine. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of crickets, the gentle ripple of water, the sound of us both breathing. He got out and leaned against the car, looking out over the lake. "This is where I come when the world gets too loud," he said softly. I joined him. "It's beautiful." He nodded. "Yeah. Reminds me that peace doesn't always mean quiet, sometimes it just means acceptance." We stood there for a while, not talking, just existing side by side. The night wrapped around us like a blanket, and I realized how rare that kind of silence is, the kind that doesn't demand to be filled. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "You ever think about starting over?" The question caught me off guard. "I used to," I said after a moment. "But I always tell myself it's too late." He turned to me, eyes thoughtful. "You know what I think? It's never too late to be someone new. We just have to decide which version of ourselves we're ready to meet." That line stayed with me long after he said it. It wasn't just about change, it was about forgiveness. About giving yourself permission to breathe again after years of holding your breath. We sat on the hood of his car, sipping the lukewarm coffee he kept in a thermos. He told me about his students, how some of them still called him, even years later. "They used to think I knew everything," he said with a grin. "Truth is, I was just learning how to listen." I told him about my younger self, how she used to dream of painting, traveling, writing letters to people she'd never met. "I think I lost her somewhere between responsibilities and routines," I said quietly. He looked at me, not with pity, but with understanding. "Maybe she's not lost," he said. "Maybe she's just waiting for you to remember her." The moonlight shimmered across the lake, painting silver lines over the water. I don't know why, but I felt tears sting my eyes, not from sadness, but from something like recognition. For so long, I had been living on pause, moving through life as if waiting for a sign to start again. And there, beside a man I barely knew, I realized that maybe this quiet, unexpected connection was that sign. When it grew late, Daniel drove me home. The ride was slower this time, the kind of slow that made every passing streetlight feel like a heartbeat. Before I got out, he said, "You know, it's funny. We spend our lives thinking we're lost, but sometimes all it takes is a single conversation to find our way again." I smiled. "Maybe that's what you do, Daniel. You drive people home in more ways than one." He laughed softly. "Maybe. Or maybe I just remind them that they were never really lost to begin with." When I stepped out of the car, I looked back once more before he drove away. And for a moment, I felt something I hadn't in years: gratitude. Not for the past, not even for what might come next, but for the present, for that night by the lake, for the sound of quiet roads, for the reminder that human connection, even the briefest kind, can mend the cracks we thought would never close. That I went to bed that night feeling lighter than I had in a long time. And though I didn't know it yet, that simple drive had already begun to change the way I saw everything, including myself. I didn't see Daniel for almost 2 weeks after that night by the lake. Life, as it always does, crept back in with its deadlines, meetings, and quiet routines. But something inside me had shifted. I woke up earlier, let sunlight into my apartment, played soft music while I made breakfast. Little things that used to feel unnecessary now felt like small promises to myself. Still, there were moments when I'd look out the window at the passing cars and wonder which one was his. I never saved his number, though I could have. Maybe it was my way of leaving space for fate, to see if life would let our paths cross again on its own. It happened one rainy evening. I was standing under a broken bus shelter, umbrella useless in the wind, when a familiar car slowed to a stop beside me. The window rolled down, and there he was, that calm face, that same steady smile. "Looks like your timing's still good," he said. "Or maybe yours," I replied, laughing as I got in. The rain was heavy, drumming on the roof like soft percussion. For a while, neither of us spoke. It was enough just to be there, the quiet comfort of shared space filling the silence. "Finally," Daniel said, "you've been on my route a lot lately." I was starting to wonder if the universe was giving me a hint. "Maybe it was," I said. "Or maybe it just didn't want the story to end yet." He smiled at that, the kind of smile that makes you feel seen. Instead of driving home, we ended up at the coffee shop again. The owner recognized us and greeted us like old friends. Same table, same cinnamon coffee, same warm light spilling across the rain-speckled windows. But that night, something was different. Not in a way that needed to be spoken, just a quiet understanding that both of us were standing at a crossroad we hadn't planned for. Daniel stirred his coffee slowly, watching the spoon circle the cup. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about leaving the city. Maybe moving closer to the mountains. Less noise, more sky." I hesitated. "You'd stop driving?" "Maybe not stop. Just change the road I take." There was a long pause. I stared down at my cup, the steam blurring my reflection. "You ever get scared of change?" "Every day," he said. "But I've learned that fear doesn't mean stop. Sometimes it just means you're standing at the edge of something true." His words stayed in the air between us, heavy and gentle at once. I didn't know what to say, so I asked, "Do you ever regret it? All the things you left behind?" He shook his head. "Not anymore. Regret fades when you start forgiving yourself. That's the hard part, learning that you did the best you could with what you knew then." I looked up, and for a moment, our eyes met, not in longing, but in understanding. There was something deeply human in that moment, something honest. Two people who had lived, lost, and learned that life has its own quiet rhythm of giving and taking. When we left the cafe, the rain had stopped. The streets shimmered under the streetlights, puddles reflecting the soft glow of the city. He offered to drive me home, and I accepted. The ride was silent again, but peaceful. As we neared my building, I realized something. I didn't feel lonely anymore. Not because Daniel had filled the emptiness, but because he had reminded me that connection still exists, that kindness still matters. When we stopped in front of my apartment, I turned to him. "Daniel, if you do move to the mountains, I hope you find what you're looking for." He smiled faintly. "I think I already have. Sometimes, what we're looking for isn't a place, it's a feeling. And you reminded me of that." I felt my throat tighten, but I managed to say, "Thank you. For everything." He nodded. "No, thank you. You listened." Most people don't realize how rare that is. There was a long pause before he spoke again, softer this time. "Whatever road you take next, make sure it's one that belongs to you." I got out, closed the door gently, and stood there as his car disappeared down the street. One last time that night, I didn't cry. I didn't feel heartbreak, either. What I felt was gratitude, deep, steady gratitude for the kind of connection that doesn't ask for more than understanding. Weeks turned into months. I never saw him again, but I still thought of him sometimes, when I passed a taxi late at night, or when a familiar song played in the cafe near my office, and every time, I smiled. Because some people aren't meant to stay, they're meant to arrive, to remind you that you're still alive, and to leave you better than they found you. It's been years now. I still drive to the lake sometimes, especially on quiet evenings when the sky is painted with gold and violet. I sit by the water, close my eyes, and remember that night, the hum of the car, the sound of rain, the soft voice of a man who taught me that sometimes strangers are just angels in plain clothes, and maybe that's all Daniel ever was. A reminder that even the briefest encounters can change the entire course of a life, not with grand gestures, but with gentle, honest moments that make you remember who you are. So when I tell this story, I don't tell it with sadness. I tell it with warmth. Because that night, and every night that followed, taught me something simple yet unforgettable, that sometimes, the most unexpected invitations lead us exactly where we need to go.